And this is a moment that our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be reading about in the history books. This is the moment. We are living the gender equality revolution.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Michael Kaufman. He's a writer, advisor, and speaker who engages men and boys in promoting gender equality and in transforming men's lives. His work has taken him around the world over the past 4 decades, and he has worked extensively with the United Nations, with governments, with non-governmental organizations, corporations, trade unions, and universities. In 2018, he was the only man on the G7 Gender Equality Advisory Council. His newest book is called The Time Has Come: Why Men Must Join the Gender Equality Revolution, and we dig into that book in this conversation. We also talk about the importance of men taking responsibility, but that this is not about self-flagellation. We talk about language, but we don't get too far into semantics. In fact, Michael says that sometimes we need to lighten up. If you didn't believe in men and the innate goodness of men, you wouldn't believe that you could have a just world, is one of the things that we talk about. The difference between intention and outcome, the power and the resistance of tradition, how we internalize gender expectations and social norms, the difference between equality and equity or fairness, the importance of empathy, and the difference between gender equality being a silver bullet or a silver lining. Finally, we talk about the importance of listening, and I think that is definitely a theme of this conversation. Now, if you like this show, I just wanted to ask, as always, that you give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use, and also, if you can, give it a shout out on social media. You can go to the website at any time, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to listen to all previous episodes and to get in touch with me, to give me your feedback on this episode or any other, and to give me your suggestions for future guests or future topics to be discussed on this show. Michael Kaufman, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Ben.
It's great to have you. I'm really excited to chat with you. I read your book, The Time Has Come: Why Men Must Join the Gender Equality Revolution. Am I saying that right?
Absolutely.
Excellent. That book had a lot of insight for me. It moved me. It made me think a lot about the world around us. And, of course, answering this question, what on earth is going on? That book, I think, is a very good response to it. But I'm also nervous about this conversation a little bit because when I'm talking about most things on this program, whether it's history, sociology, chemistry, science, whatever, I can view them from a distance. I can take this intellectual perspective of the scholar and talk about them that way. But when we talk about the gender equality revolution, when we talk about the role that men and women play in feminism and in bringing about a more just and fair society, we're talking about our own personal behavior. We're talking about ourselves. And therefore, I have to put the microscope on myself and the way I speak, the way I act in my life. And that makes me wonder, especially around somebody who's been involved in this world for so long, what am I doing wrong? I don't necessarily think the conversation we have to go there all the way, but I am curious as to what things I can do and our listeners can do to bring about this very necessary change, which, as you've mentioned many times before, is good for everybody. It's not just good for women. But before we get to all of that, Michael, we've got the first question, which is always the same, and you can take this anywhere and any way you want. What on earth is going on?
Well, we truly are living in a moment of history, the gender equality revolution. Male-dominated societies, what we call patriarchal societies, go back 8,000 or 10,000 years, which is a long time, but in the sweep of humans pretty much like us, it's just it's a bit of a scratch. But what's happening is right now in the course of 1, 2, 3 generations, age-old ideas, ideals, assumptions, structures, and institutions are getting overturned, are being swept away. Now, for many people, that's a troubling thing. One reason we see a bit of a backlash is people who are unsure where they now stand. But at the same time, it's also an incredibly exciting moment. And as you said, it's both a moment that is affecting us in terms of how we think about our social priorities, what's happening in our workplaces, political policies, but it's also intensely personal. We're talking about who we are as women, as men, as those who refuse to be set within a gender binary, to really challenge our assumptions. And that makes it both an amazingly exciting moment. Also, it's a difficult moment, let's face it. It's a difficult moment because we're not just changing, this law. We're not just working on bringing more women and making sure more women are equally represented in workplaces and at all levels of government, but we're also thinking about and challenging and reshaping our personal lives, our sexual lives, who does the work in the home, who looks after the kids. So it is a really sweeping change. And one of the things that where I start from, though, is that it is a positive change for men. A difficult change, but in the bottom line, it's a very positive change, and we can talk about that. And even though it is difficult, as you said in the introduction, for men in many ways, I don't believe that men should bear some sort of collective guilt. This book and my work is not about finger-pointing. It certainly is about men taking responsibility for our own actions, our own behavior, and that's true. This is not about just we're all the same, we're all in this together. Yes, if you're in a group that has enjoyed certain forms of privilege or power just by a 50-50 roll of the dice at birth, there's a certain responsibility that comes with that. So yes, let's as men take responsibility to look within ourselves and to do some really good listening to those who haven't had the collective voices that men have had in our society. But at the same time, this is not about sort of self-flagellation. In the Middle Ages, there were these parades that would go through European cities, towns, and these parades of flagellants, and mainly men, but men and women would just be scourging themselves with whips to punish themselves for their sins. Well, this is not what men embracing feminism is all about. It is not about self-hatred. It's not about self-abnegation. It is about a celebration of men's capacity to be fully wonderful human beings and to do it as allies with women, as allies with different groups of men who haven't enjoyed the same privileges that some of us men have enjoyed. So this is really what's going on is I think is a challenging but a very positive moment for us to be alive.
Well, I think this is, it's almost self-evident that in order for me to be a bigger, better, fuller person, I need people around me who are bigger, better, fuller, and complete people, accepted as complete people. I'm a better person if I can have a conversation with somebody who has respect and dignity like anybody else. And I think that I'm lesser, I'm weaker if I choose to create some kind of hierarchy, which is about my gender or my race, or it could be about any of these things. And there's an underlying theme to all of this, I think, which is the classic feminist adage that the personal is political. But I want to talk about this word feminism too. And I wonder if this is still the appropriate word. I know you use it. Another thing that you talk about in your book is that we should reclaim the word liberation, as in the women's liberation in the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s. Or are we talking about humanism? I mean, I know we're talking about semantics and words, but words can often guide our thinking. So what's the most appropriate kind of catch-all word or phrase that we can use? Is it the gender equality revolution? I mean, what are we talking about here?
We really need different words and different phrases, and not get too stuck on, if you don't say it my way, you're the problem. One of the things that I think is unfortunate is those who, you could say, have a progressive mindset and progressive political stance. We've tended to spend a lot of time, debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And if you don't say, this set of words in the exactly right way, you are, as big a problem as, who knows who. And part, I think we need to lighten up a bit. And, language is important and terms are important. But we can also sort of embrace different words and say this is all part of the picture. I still think feminism is a very useful title. It's as a man talking about feminism, there's two big issues. One is feminism as a set of ideas about women's equality, women's empowerment, women's rights. And those are things that men can absolutely and fully not only endorse, but live by, advocate, and push for. There is another part of feminism which, as a man, is not about our lives, which is feminism is certainly an individual and collective statement of women's experiences. And so back to that personal as political has several meanings. One is that feminism as a statement of women's experiences, which in societies where men have occupied the airwaves, where men have written and proclaimed the religious codes and the civil codes and the cultural norms, women's voices for too long have been suppressed. So part of the women's movement, starting in the 60s, the so-called second wave of feminism, was that reclaiming of women's voices by women. And for that, men's access to that comes by listening. And one of the things that I think as men we have to start with, if we're going to embrace the world of gender equality and the gender equality revolution, is listening with respect to the voices of women. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to agree with everything we hear, because we're going to hear different opinions on many different things. But to listen, to take it in, not to just immediately jump in and say, oh, I'm not like that, or I'm not sexist, but just listen, just take it in. Feminism is still a useful term, I think. It's also for many people still a difficult term, because we've still had these ideas that have been in the media and in popular culture of a certain image of what a feminist is or supposed to be. And, you still hear this stuff that feminists hate men, and which for me is one of the most bizarre statements ever, because think about it. The feminist movement believes in a world without men's violence. Just for example, it believes in a world without men's violence, believes in a world where men can be equal nurturers and caregivers in our homes. So if you didn't believe in men, if you didn't believe in the innate goodness of men, you wouldn't believe you could have a world like that. And because feminists believe that we can have relationships and a society and streets and workplaces that are free of men's violence, and so forth, it shows an incredible love and trust and belief in the capacity of men to be loving, caring. But we still have these stereotypes. Oh, feminists are anti-male. I mean, just what? I mean, it's just crazy stuff.
Yeah, it was interesting. About 5 years ago, you were promoting your book, A Guy's Guide to Feminism. And in one of your talks, you mentioned that there was a study done here in Canada that showed that 99% of people believed in basic rights for women. They believe that women and men should be equal, that they should be paid the same for the same amount of work, that women shouldn't have more violence or have violence done to them because they're women, like all of this basic stuff that is pretty much, if not 99%, then 100% that we all agree with. It's just basic stuff. And yet, in the same poll, or maybe it was something different, very few people relate to themselves, including women, as feminists. And yet that's what feminism is. It's just establishment of gender equality. And why is there this disconnect? And I think you're very correct when you say that we don't have to use these words if they're going to cause such commotion. What's important is the principles underneath them and the things that we're fighting for, which I think we can all agree. And then we get to the second question is, well, if we all agree with this stuff, then why isn't it happening? If we all agree that women should be paid the same amount as men for the same amount of work, then why do we still see a massive pay gap? And so that's, I guess, my next question to you, which is, why is there this gap between our intentions and what's actually happening, and what can we do to just close that gap and make things, again, more equal?
Well, we still have this massive gap for a number of reasons. Now, before though, let me just say the gap is narrowing. And this is important because often those of us who are concerned about social problems, we focus on the problems, but we don't focus enough on movement towards solutions. And I don't just mean in the future, but in the past. So when we compare the world in whether North America or Europe, the rest of the world, South America, parts of Africa, Asia, where change in some of these things has been a bit slower perhaps, but change is happening. And so the constellation, the relationships in terms of women's empowerment, in terms of women's rights, is totally different than it was when the modern women's movement started in the late 60s, early 70s. And so I think one of the things we have to do is celebrate the positive change. And that change has happened because of women organizing. The reason why we now in Canada and the US and the UK and elsewhere have businesses talking about the promotion of women, businesses enacting codes around and doing training around preventing sexual harassment, why we have even though again there's still gaps, but while we have women's property rights and we see women in equal numbers or greater numbers in higher education, is not because of the benevolence of men first and foremost, but it's because of the pressure, the organizing, the sheer guts and determination of women. But we've had more and more men responding positively to that. So let's first of all say, before we say where we need to go and what we need to do, is to really celebrate what has happened. Because if we don't celebrate, then we'd be left asking, well, what's been the point of all the hard work and the lives, literally people's lives spent working for change? Has it been for nothing? And I don't think so. That much said, we still have a ways to go. And the reason we have a ways to go is, I think there's several reasons. At a social level, bringing about equality is taking on structures and institutions. And the thing about institutions is that institutions institutionalize things. Institutions, in this case, institutionalize sexism. There's ways of doing things that perpetuate problems. So let me give you just a what seems like just a petty little example, one minor example, but isn't so petty. So let's say in a workplace, you have leaders in a professional setting, or managers in a workplace have a regular meeting every Monday morning at 8:30 in the morning, let's say, before at the very beginning, or even before a lot of people's workday. So you think, well, that's just when we do it. We're getting the week started. That's how we do it. Well, if women are still disproportionately doing the childcare, looking after the kids, having more responsibility for taking them to school, that's still disproportionately women's job. It means that women aren't going to be able to make those meetings. And so it's going to mean that their chance of promotion, or if they can't after work hang out with others and go for that drink or whatever, that's going to limit. So there's a case where just an institution, a tradition, and that's just one little example, gets in the way of women's advancement. Now, of course, it happens at a much grander level than just something like that. It happens in terms of what laws we have, what laws we don't have. It was still within my memory, and which is a bit longer than your memory, but within my memory, there was a time when it was legal for a man to rape his wife. So you still had it embedded in laws, what laws you had, what laws you didn't have. There's still parts of the world where women don't have full property rights. So you have things that you have inequality embedded in our institutions, our structures, in our religions. We have major world religions where women are not seen as close to God. They can't perform rites and sacraments in many religions. And so it's just perpetuated over and over again, and it lives on, and people just say, well, it's the way it is, or it's our tradition. So that's one level. The other level that makes it hard is that when we talk about our structures of patriarchy, our sexism, it's not just ideas that float into our heads. As we grow up, we become gendered. You mentioned, sort of our brains and neural connections. When we're a baby, when we're born, our bodies are basically fully developed. They're just a small version of our adult selves. The one part, though, that is only 10% developed in its complexity and its adult, what it's going to be, is our brains. And every single day, a newborn baby is creating millions of new neural connections. And that's why babies sleep so much. The energy that's going into building their brain is just staggering. And what's happening is that that building is in relationship to their environment. They're taking in their physical environment, their social environment. So let me give you an example. So one story I tell in the book is when my son was born. So there we are in the delivery room, and my kid had been born for 5 seconds, and I didn't yet know if it was a boy or a girl. Not because I'm dumb. You've got a guest here who kind of has got that figured out. But at this point, I had so many tears in my eyes, I couldn't see the little thing. And I mean the little thing on the little thing. I didn't know if it was a boy or girl until the nurse spoke. Now, until this moment, the nurse had been speaking in her normal voice, and suddenly her voice dropped down really deep, and she said, "It's a boy. What a strong little fellow." Now, I was totally shocked. Not because it was a boy. I'd taken high school biology. I figured 50-50 chance, more or less. But I was shocked by the change in her voice and what she said. And here my kid was 5 seconds old, and he was being fitted for his first football jersey. Now, you say, okay, so what? It's not like, he's squirmed into the world and is thinking, my goodness, I'm being socialized in gender expectations. But what's happening is we are, from that moment on, there's just a barrage of things that, studies show that we hold baby boys and girls differently. We use different tones of voice. We, of course, dress them differently. We give them different toys as they get older. And they see things around them. They take in stuff. So even something you think, again, as trivial as you look at a car where there's a man and a woman in the front seat, chances are it's going to be the man driving. Not, obviously not always, but the odds are. So a little kid in the back seat is seeing this and thinking, wow, it takes a man to handle this powerful, huge piece of equipment. Anyway, this is every single day. So what's happening is that his or her brain is becoming gendered. There's no such thing as a male or female brain at birth. There's, the earlier, some of the books and popular stuff coming out about that a few years ago, it's just bogus. We're 90, our chromosomes or our genes are, 98.6% the same. Our hormonal differences when we're young, yes, there are some average differences, but they're not as dramatic as later on. And even later on, they're just average differences. So this idea that somehow we're intrinsically different or the opposite just doesn't wash. But we become different because we internalize the gender expectations. We internalize the norms of a society right into our developing brain. And that's one reason why change is difficult, because we become men and women, not just male and female.
So let me pitch something to you that I've had to wrestle with ever since I had a conversation with him some months ago. It was in Newfoundland. It was episode 26 of this podcast. And just to take a step back from this, the reason I'm asking this is because we're talking about what one of our ideals in our world today, in the Western world, is this flattening of difference, right? And that one of the best ways that we can overcome the prejudices, the discrimination between us, is to make sure that we're seen as equal, that we're the same, that there is no legal difference between us, there's no social difference between us, man or woman, black, white, Asian, American, it doesn't matter, young or old, we can flatten these differences. And that is something that I've held as a value for most of my life. And it was challenged by someone who I interviewed about racism. His name is Suleiman Giwa. He's originally from Nigeria, and he teaches social work at Memorial University in Newfoundland. He's a gay black man. And he said to me, I don't want you to be colorblind. If you don't see race, you don't see me. Now, I had grown up with the idea that eventually one day, the color of a person's skin will be the same as the color of your eyes, the color of your hair. It will be just as irrelevant to me when I meet you. And I'm sorry to say that up to this point in the conversation and since I met you, I haven't noticed the color of your eyes. I don't think it's affected my thinking of you. I don't think. Maybe subconsciously somewhere. You have brown eyes, I take it?
Yeah, I was going to tell your listeners I had brilliant turquoise eyes that are part of my stunning
and they've thrown me off this entire time. Yeah. But anyways, Suleiman said to me, if you don't see race, you don't see me. And he was essentially saying, I don't want to get to a place where race is the same as eye color or hair color. I want it to remain an important distinction. And I, as a gay black man, I had to, who has many differences from me that he wants to celebrate. Does that also apply to the difference between men and women without having to be opposite? Is there an application there, or how do we struggle with this one?
That's very cool. I think there's a couple of different questions, even what he was saying, which is interesting because there's there's our racialized experiences, identities, and I think that one of the things that we all need to do is to celebrate those different experiences, those different parts of our identity, find strength in them, find contradictions in them, whatever they are, find blind spots within all of them. So there are those things, and I think that particularly those of us in a socially dominant group definitely need to do. That's part of the listening I talked about earlier on. So not to pretend that Black brother doesn't have different experiences, and listen and understand and celebrate that, not just to just assume, okay, it's not there. Because if you assume it's not there, what you're saying, you're going back to the norm. And if it's a white norm in North America, that just becomes like supposedly the default human being, and that becomes racist by definition, because I'm not the default human being. So I think that's partly what he's responding to. I do think there's a bigger question that race is something that is socially constructed. We become raced
in the same way we become gendered.
Exactly,
right?
And so it's linked up to structures of oppression, of discrimination, of hierarchy. And but I don't think noticing is natural. I remember when I was young, we lived. My parents are Canadian. But I was born in the U.S. and in the North, in Cleveland. Then when I was 9, this is back in 1960, we moved down to Durham, North Carolina. And this was the heart of racial segregation. And I remember at one point my little sister, my youngest sister, Judith, we all knew, and we were, different ages, but sort of figuring out racism and segregation and all that. And I remember my sister when she was in kindergarten. So not, young enough, to still be figuring out the world, but old enough to have some things figured out. So she was, 5 years old, maybe 6, I don't remember exactly. But her best friend at this school, which was one of the rare integrated schools, was an African-American girl. So they would do things together after school, which at the time in Durham was really, it was extremely unusual. So my mom told me a story years ago of one day she had the two girls with her at a supermarket or whatever, and they were walking along holding hands. And some white woman just said something to my mom about how wrong this is or something. And was really like laying into my mother. So later, my sister Judith asked, "What was that about?" And my mother, as you would explain things to little kids, she was explaining, well, there's people who, using, she used what was then the progressive word Negro at the time. She said, there are those who. Basically, she's explaining racism again and don't like it when white people are friends with, let's say now, black people. And Judith was a little girl saying, "Oh, yes, I know. But why was she getting mad?" And my mom said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, why would she get mad because I was playing with Karen, her friend?" And mom said, "Well, she's black." And Judith hadn't noticed.
Wow, okay.
Like she said, yeah. "Oh, I didn't know that." And so, so when I hear people say, "Oh, well, we naturally notice that," I go, "Well, here's a story that says otherwise." But who knows? But I think around gender and this idea of difference, when we think about becoming gendered, what that process is in part about is first of all, the assumption of unequal power. So it's not just that we have certain things that we define as masculine or feminine. The qualities that we in any society define as masculine, and they differ from one society to another, are attributes that we say this is what power looks like. So, for example, the ability to suppress emotions, to not worry about your own, well-being, to play through pain, as it were. The ability to just be stoic and not ask for help. The ability to dominate in a conversation or on the sports field. We define those things as masculine, manly. They are powerful. Whereas when you think about many of those things are actually destructive qualities. They're self-destructive. They hurt men to have those qualities. The results of those things is that men die younger. We're more likely to commit suicide. We're more likely to be addicted to alcohol and other drugs. And yet we define those things in a positive way as powerful. those qualities that we've associated with femininity, having more of a emotional life, more emotional expressivity, being more empathetic, we've traditionally defined as weak. So first of all, we divide up the world's qualities, and we literally not just, celebrate them for men and women, boys and girls, but we humiliate the boy who doesn't live up to those. So the little boy falls down and cries, and we tell him, stop crying. It didn't really hurt. Basically, don't trust your feelings. We humiliate him. Big boys don't cry. Man up. And so we really just, in some cases, for some boys, we beat it out of them to have these qualities that we define as weak. So it has to do with how we define power, how we in some cases literally beat out of boys a whole spectrum of feelings, possibilities, emotions. Traditionally, we've done that to the opposite, to girls and women. The women's movement going back to the 60s has said, no, we don't buy it. All these different things we can do too. The result is some of the things that we assume are the physical differences are starting to disappear. Now, I don't mean some of the basic biological differences in our place in the process of reproduction, but for example, if you look at Olympic records in many different events, the gap between the elite male athletes and the elite female athletes has narrowed. Both in both cases, records have obviously improved over the past 30, 40 years. But as women's opportunities increase, as coaching has increased, as diet has increased, all these things, the gap between the elite male and female athletes' records has narrowed. In other words, what we assume was a huge biological gap is narrowing. Now, in some, because men on average have more muscle mass, and an elite male athlete on average is going to have more muscle mass than an elite female athlete, what it means is that probably there'll be, that some gap will endure. But part of that gap is a socially created gap. But we're also talking about average differences, because any woman athlete is, stronger, faster, all those things than I ever was and ever will be. And even though I am a prime specimen of athleticism, he says with tongue in cheek. But these are, these again, we're talking about average differences. And so we have to be careful on this assumption that we're somehow intrinsically, totally different. It just doesn't work. Well, it's a spectrum.
Institutions institutionalize things. They perpetuate problems. This is a point that Michael brought up in our conversation that I wanted to highlight, because institutions are the underpinning, the bedrock of our society, our culture, our laws, the way that we do things, the contracts that we have between one another. But they're also the things that embed the differences between one another. They embed the things that we may want to change or even overthrow. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about the difference in the debate between intention and impact. But this is important because these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Well, and you mentioned earlier, genetics, and I think if there's anything that is going to make us different from one another on a basic level prior to being gendered, prior to being racialized, it's going to be genetic, obviously, and I'm not really saying anything special there, but I think it was in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, but it might have been something else, where the genetic differences between different peoples on the planet are almost nil. In fact, two different groups of people in Nigeria, one country in Africa, are more genetically different from one another than from a Nigerian to any other person on the planet. There's more genetic diversity in Nigeria than there is in the rest of the planet, right? Now, there are many, many counterintuitive ideas about genetics that we've encountered over the last 10, 20, 30 years that have taught us a lot about who we are, right? And I think if we look at the genetic differences between men and women, we realize that the gap of being gendered is much larger than the gap of our genetics. And it's a very important idea, and we have to kind of wait and see just what the differences are, not to expose them or exacerbate them, but to understand more fully how we work together. And there's no reason why that should translate into any kind of, whether it's formal inequality or social inequality. And that's another question that we're encountering here, is that, and a lot of people who argue I don't even know if I want to say against feminism, but who say, I'm not a feminist and there's no problem. And they will say, we've achieved formal equality. And I guess my question here is that there's a lot of conversation about gender today, with the Me Too movement especially. I mean, your book, The Time Has Come, is really about the time coming now. And there's a lot of information, there's a lot of different forces at play on this particular conversation. And how do we, as men, but also as women, as people who are trying to find our place in this world, and this is going back to this difference between formal inequality and social, or equality and social equality, how do we make sure that we're not overshooting the mark, but we're also not doing too little to make sure that the gender revolution takes place for everybody?
Well, I mean, there's a lot in what you just said, and really, really interesting. The diagnosis that we've heard for years about from many different men who have been resistant to gender equality and feminism focuses on a set of symptoms that I've also talked about for the past many decades in terms of men's lives. The difference is that for me, those are an expression of the paradox of manhood in a male-dominated society. In other words, men have constructed a world in which we have had and still have more power, more social power. We've been able to pursue jobs and careers because we, on average, don't do nearly as much housework and childcare, although that's thankfully beginning to change in a big way now. And that's something we maybe can take a minute to talk about in a second.
Yeah.
Because it is a major change. But for me, the reason for for the pain that men experience, for the isolation that men experience, the sadness that men experience, the health questions and challenges, isn't because of women's empowerment, but it's the ways that we have constructed the lives of men within male-dominated societies. So the problem is patriarchy. The problem is patriarchy, which is a paradox because that's also been what has given men more power and privilege. So it's a paradox. And so my work over the past many decades now, and both my writing and thinking, but also my practical work, my organizing work, my advocacy work, my activist work, has embraced this contradictory, this paradoxical reality of men's lives. And so that means, just as I talk about the importance of men listening to women's voices, it's also really important that men learn to listen better to the voices of other men. Either both other men who have different experiences as men, because patriarchy is not just a society of men's power over women. It's also a society of the power of some men over other men, based on the color of our skin, or our religion, or our socioeconomic class, or our sexual orientation. So,
and it's regional as well, like the Eurocentric patriarchy as well.
That's right. So that listening is important, but also just listening to those who might look like us and sound like us and be like us. I believe that men carry around enormous pain and isolation and fear. And the fear is often about not being a real man, not living up to these expectations of manhood.
Many of them say that patriarchy doesn't exist. And they're only right insofar as patriarchy is invisible to them, or you can choose not to see it if you wish. And it goes back to what you said earlier, that if you have an 8:30 meeting every morning, well, on the surface, that's completely fair. We all know what the time of the meeting is. There's no formal judgment that men are allowed to come to the meeting first, or women have to sit in the back row. Formally, it looks fine, but there's a hidden thing there. There's a hidden social structure that if we choose not to see, then yes, it's totally fair. And if we choose not to see the patriarchy, if we choose not to see, as you said earlier again, that which we revert to, if we just let go to the norm that is patriarchal and to the norm that favors men, then you're right. Okay, fine. Then patriarchy doesn't exist. But it only doesn't exist because you don't see it. But I do want to go back to what you were just saying. You wanted to talk about these massive changes in the way that men are taking up more of the work in the home, for example, taking care of the kids more. There's one statistic that blew my mind in your book, and you say that in 1970 in the United States, just 6 men identified as stay-at-home dads. Not 1 in 6, not 6 in 10, 6 total. That was mind-blowing. And the fact that I don't know what the statistics are today, but who were those 6 men? That's an interesting story in and of itself. Who were those 6 people? Yeah.
And now it's hundreds of thousands. One of the when I talk about the gender equality revolution, I'm really using the phrase gender equality as a shorthand to embrace a whole range of changes, because it's not just about being equal. If we have a push for a policy in a workplace to have a room for breastfeeding moms, well, that's not equality because there's no room for breastfeeding dads. But it's about equity. It's about fairness. So I'm using equality as sort of a shorthand term to embrace many changes. But I use it in also to talk about the changes in men's lives. And that's why I refer to the importance of thinking about personal and social transformation, bringing up that old 60s word liberation, whether it's the women's liberation or human liberation or social liberation movements. So yes, it is definitely a humanist agenda. It's an agenda of really thinking about the lives we lead and what we do and what we spend our time doing. And when we think about without getting it too far, but when we think about the quick pace of technological change and the replacement of jobs wholesale, we're already seeing the rug pulled out from many men who had felt, well, if I do certain things, if I suck it up and tough it out, I'm going to have a well-paying job. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be the bread earner and all this. Well, that world is quickly disappearing. It's not disappearing because of feminism. It's disappearing because of increasing inequality. It's disappearing because of the vastly increased power of corporations. It's disappearing because of government policies that have just a lot in some countries, in some cases, have led to a huge drop of unionization. But men's lives are drastically changing. But one very positive change, it's not just to fill that gap, but to really change the meaning of our lives, is a transformation of fatherhood. And this is where the one place where we're seeing the gender equality revolution just coming to life in an incredible, positive, forward-moving way in the lives of so many men. When my kids were young, and this is many years ago now, if I couldn't do something on a certain night, if I couldn't go to a meeting or see friends, they'd say, "Oh, you're babysitting tonight." Or they would say, "Oh, it's great how much you help out." And I would think, I don't babysit. If someone said that to my son now about his kids, he would just tell them where to go. He'd say, "I don't babysit. I'm a parent." And this is typical. This is a typical change now in North America and in Europe for a growing number of men in the global South. We're seeing men who are redefining their lives as parents, as caregivers, who don't just help out, who don't just pitch in, and who don't just do I spend quality time with my kids. One of the things I just say is, don't worry about the quality time, worry about the quantity time. When you have quality time with your kids, it's because you're spending a lot of quantity time. That's when you have the great discussion with your kid. It's not when you sit down and say, "Son, let's talk." It's when you're doing the dishes together, or going shopping together, or fixing a faucet or whatever it might be. And this is an area where, because of the pressure of women, because of feminism and the women's movement, both because women are now pursuing jobs and careers because our families can't get by on one income, but also because women want to be, have those diverse and full lives. Women have said to men for the last, 20, 30 years now, you've got to be doing half the work here, not just helping out. So there's been pressure from women. There's been more families where, an increasing number of families, still a minority, where women are earning more than men. So if there's a decision about who's going to take off time to look after kids, it just becomes economically logical for the man to, and hence the big increase in male stay-at-home, well, obviously male, as stay-at-home dads, and but also in some regions increasing unemployment. The state with the two states with the highest number of stay-at-home dads in the U.S. I think it's either South or North Dakota and I think West Virginia, and so it's not about new age guys. It's about men who this is what they're doing. So that's an example of an amazing change. And it's not only change, it's critical for women's empowerment, for women, for equal pay. So women can pursue those jobs and careers and not be disproportionately working part-time because they have all those responsibilities. But this is really critical for the betterment of men's lives. What it means is, to look after a particularly young child, you need to develop more empathy. because a little newborn can't talk and a toddler can't express his or her feelings. So you've got to feel what they feel. That's what empathy is. Well, as more men develop more empathy, I mean, we have empathy, of course, but it's not, for many men, it's not as developed as it could be. So what the result we're going to see socially is less violence. Because if you are empathetic, if you can feel the pain that others feel, it's harder to hurt them. You can feel the pain you're causing. That's what empathy is. But positively, it also makes men better leaders. I've talked to men who are, at sort of very senior positions in the world of, in the corporate world, who are taking on half the childcare. And it gets in the way of work, obviously, in some super demanding jobs. But they'll say, yeah, it's made me a better leader. I'm a better listener. I'm more responsive to different needs. I can pick up emotional cues better. I'm a better leader because I'm doing half the parenting.
Well, and you mentioned a few minutes ago, growing economic inequality. You also mentioned the increasing corporate power in our world today, and this is something that is growing perhaps just as quickly as the gender equality revolution. Not too long ago, I had on this podcast Sally Armstrong, the Canadian journalist who wrote a book called Ascent of Women, and she said that she called Me Too before it happened. And one thing that Sally said, and she's echoed something that's been said many times before, which is that the empowerment of women is one of our 2 silver bullets for solving the world's problems, the other one being education. And that if you empower women in countries and places all over the world, then you can create massive economic change. And it's something that you mentioned in your book, The Time Has Come, that the increase to GDP by simply bringing women into the workforce around the world and having them have an equal part is enormous. I think it's something like 26% an increase in GDP to the global economy. And it's a profound...
Or 26 trillion, I think.
Or 26, yeah. Was it 26
something
trillion?
Like that, some incredible...
An incredible number. And it makes me ask the question, is the gender equality revolution the silver lining to the dark cloud of growing inequality, or is it the antidote?
Wow. Is it the silver lining or the antidote?
And I recognize you're not an economist, and neither am I, and we're
know.
Pulling out the crystal ball here, but...
I think... Tell me in what way would be the silver lining? Tell me what your...
Well, the silver lining would be that, let's just say that inequality continues to grow and polarization continues to grow until we get to a society that is so divided economically, not necessarily by gender or even ethnicity, even though we know that economics and gender and ethnicity are all linked. But the main thing is how much money you have. And we go to what Naomi Klein calls the global green zone, which was, the green zone in Baghdad, Iraq, this protected area during the Iraq War after the Americans invaded, where everything was good. In fact, it was almost a socialized world where you had free healthcare, free education, and everything was provided for. But outside the green zone, if you couldn't afford to be there, it was chaos and war. And that Naomi Klein has said before that we're moving that direction. If inequality continues this way, then we will build green zones in every city on the planet. And that if you're inside, that means you have the wealth and the resources to be so. Now, that can all happen with perfect equality between men and women. And what I'm asking is the gender equality revolution actually something that would not allow that to happen? Is it something that would prevent this and maybe turn the tide away from this growing inequality that we empirically experience?
And I think that tells us that gender equality is not enough. So yes, you could imagine, and we're seeing it, this world of increasing, and not just increasing, but rapidly increasing inequality and the impact of that. And it's going to be magnified, that inequality and the impact by the quickly emerging crisis from climate change. It's going to become the inequality. It becomes who survives in some cases. So you can imagine that within it being in the context of gender equality, where we now have more. We're seeing more women at the top of big companies. The person who has presided over all this stuff with Facebook is a woman who talks about gender equality. And so what that tells me is that gender equality is not enough. yes, we want gender equality. Yes, we want equal representation of women, whether it's the top of our political structures or economic structures and religious structures. We will benefit from it. Is just a basic human right that we have gender equality. So I'm all for those who are saying, yes, we need equal numbers of women as CEOs and this and that. Absolutely. But that's not enough.
Sounds like it's a silver lining in search of other silver linings.
Yeah, it's a silver lining, but it's not enough. I mean, I think certainly for me and for most feminists, it's not to celebrate a world of Margaret Thatcher's who can wage war as she did, as well as any man could do.
In a way, many have argued that Margaret Thatcher simply joined the patriarchy.
Well, that's right, because that goes back to the fact that patriarchy is about structures and structures of power and hierarchy, how we've defined power. And so within a framework of just equality, sure, just as men learn to populate that. One of the things that we often hear from women who are, working to get ahead within, whether it's a government bureaucracy or the corporate world, say, well, I've got to learn to act like a man. I've got to learn to talk a certain way and dress a certain way and look at people a certain way and shake hands a certain way. And I've got to learn to be like a man. And one of the things I say to that is, yeah, well, that's exactly what men have been doing since we were born. This is learned behavior, and it hasn't worked well for men. It's worked well for men, but it's also not. This is that paradox. And so for me, the ideal, and that's the last chapter of my book. I mean, in my book, I talk about this paradox. I talk about what men can do in terms of what men need to know in terms of the impact on women, but also the impact on men. I have chapters talking about ending men's violence, about the transformation of fatherhood, about our workplace and economies. But my last chapter is a bit of almost a bait and switch, where I say, beyond gender equality, why gender equality is not enough, and why we really have to talk about transformation. And I think in no other era has this been as critical. Because, for example, when we think about patriarchy, I already said it's a system of men's power over women, but also the power of some men over others. But it's also about the power of men and humans over nature. This idea of domination is the bottom line of patriarchy. You dominate, you control. And we now see what a terrific job and how wonderful it is when humans dominate nature. We suddenly have the capacity not just to dominate nature in a small area, but in the world, and so the idea that this of the Anthropocene era, that this is the era that humans have changed the physical world is upon us, and it's a disaster, and it's going to get worse.
Well, and there's a theme to a lot of what you said, which is listening, and it sounds to me like the climate change is occurring because we haven't been listening for a long time. The gender equality revolution is necessary because we weren't listening. Economic inequality is growing because we haven't listened and paid attention to what's really happening and asked ourselves, what will happen if this continues? What will happen if we continue to separate and divide men and women as we do, as well as all these other things, right? And one thing we're talking about here are the gaps, right? The gaps between men and women, of course, the gap between the way men and women are paid. But there's another gap that you talk about in your book between intention and impact. And this is something that I wanted to raise because it's being debated by social scientists, by commentators, journalists, politicians all over the world, because it is very much embedded in our legal system. The difference between intention and impact. And in your book, you very much clearly say, and I think this is partly the result of you being very much involved in fighting against men's violence against women back in the 80s and 90s. And it doesn't really matter what your intention is. If your impact is harmful in the harassment of a woman, then that's really all that matters. And it's a very important feminist statement. But I did want to just ask about this because it is a complicated question. When I was walking here, I got splashed by a truck, and it was a big splash. He went right through a puddle, and I got soaked, and my glasses were wet, and whatever. Now, I'm not complaining about it. I'm not saying that you should fix the potholes on your street, Michael. No, I'm actually just saying that this happened. I got sprayed by this truck. He probably didn't intend to do this, or she, and I went on my way. I wasn't angry. But the impact was the same, whether or not he intended it. right? That I was still sprayed. Now, if he had intended it or she had intended it, well, then I would have a right to be mad and I'd have a right to do something about it. And our law says the same thing, right? If I run into somebody by accident and hurt them, well, then I'm on the hook, but to a much lesser extent than if I did it on purpose. So where do you, I mean, and this is a very important conversation when it comes to harassment and violence and the work that you've done. Can we just talk a little bit about this gap between intention and impact? And is it so simple as to say that impact is all that matters? Maybe in some circumstances it is, but yeah.
Intention certainly can be important, and legally we do make a distinction between murder and manslaughter, where you've done something that you intended to do. It has, in that case, a lethal consequence. Even that truck splashing you. If we raise and have a whole society that's more of a nurturing, caregiving society. A truck or a car driving along a street at the end of winter, which is when we're talking, where there's invisible potholes and puddles, and you see a pedestrian, you're going to slow down. You're going to know that person could get splashed. So it's how you choose the quality you're choosing to live your life, to respect for others. Your intention may not be to splash that person, but the inaction, lack of care, led to, as you say, the same result.
But not to belabor the point, like what if that driver simply didn't see the puddle and it was pure accident? There was nothing they could have done to prevent it.
Yeah. Well, then it's just an accident. And we just say it was an accident and you were right not to get bent out of shape because of that. There are things, though, that when we talk about sexual harassment, for example, you mentioned that, what becomes critical in most cases is to talk about the impact. I say in most cases, but if the sort of the classic, if you sleep with me, I'll give you a job, or when we think of Harvey Weinstein, it's not sleep, it's anyway, whatever with me. And so there the intent is clear. The intent is part of the problem or is the source of the problem. But there's other forms of harassment that are not they're not the big dramatic, it's going to make a headline, but are like this sort of, I call it in the book, that this drip, drip, drip in women's lives. It's the unwanted touch, it's the unwanted look, the unwanted joke, it's the suggestion, it's the compliment that doesn't feel like a compliment.
All of which a man can say, I didn't mean anything by it.
Yeah, I meant to be friendly. And that's where it becomes important to think about impact, the impact of our actions. How is it making that other person feel? Are they feeling, singled out or just appreciated for how they look, or made to feel uncomfortable in front of their workmates? They're about to give a presentation to a department, and they're introduced as being, my good-looking assistant, or you look fantastic today, and it's meant as a compliment, but it's not. It's not what she would want or he would want in that context. So the impact can be really important. I think, though, the problem in the gender equality revolution is both understanding intention, but really I think there's so many men. I think most men don't act in sexist ways increasingly because we want to be sexist or we think the men are better. I don't think most men think that anymore. Some do, but most don't. But I think we still have to look at the impact of our words, our actions. But there is a final group we have to talk about, because when we're talking about, we were talking about the environment, it's not just about, it isn't just about listening. It's about the power that some people and organizations have to manipulate ideas and opinions. We've had, just like with the cigarette companies and tobacco, we've had oil and gas and coal companies working overtime to manipulate public opinion about climate change. And they are murdering, they're immediately murdering people because of deaths from urban pollution, for example, but they're also committing future crime. They're committing crimes against humanity, as far as I'm concerned. So we also have to talk about about power. We have to talk about who still controls, who still calls the shots, who can disproportionately have an impact on laws and legislations, how money gets spent, who it gets spent on. And that's why political action is really important. And that's the amazing thing. And it goes back to your first words in our conversation. This is about the world out there. It's about the world in here, in my home and your home, in my relationships and your relationships. It is about those things. It's about both those levels. And we have a tendency, and I think particularly we see it particularly strongly in the U.S., where I do a lot of work and talking. We see that things get reduced to the individual. All you need to do is just lean in that classic thing, or just make this change in your life, or just believe in this, or believe in yourself. That's important. In individual initiative and a sense of our own capacity for change is critical, but we also have to take political action and social action. So here's a contrast, talking about the importance of the transformation of fatherhood, the importance for women, for gender equality, for men's well-being. So in the U.S. is one of 3 countries in the world, along with Papua New Guinea and Lesotho, that doesn't have paid parental leave for everyone, for every parent. And so it doesn't matter if you may be a dad who wants to take months off, or a mom who wants to take time off. You just can't do it. If you're in a minimum wage job or even a okay job, you literally can't afford to do that. And so the U.S. politicians who talk about we're all for the family. Well, they haven't enacted policies that actually help families. Meanwhile, one great thing that has happened recently in Canada is parental leave was extended to include what gets called, following the Nordic model, daddy days. And these are, in the case of Canada, paid parental leave as was recently, this is in March of 2019, recently increased by 5 weeks. And those 5 weeks can only be used by either a father or a second female parent. And so we have a conscious policy to promote gender equality. So it's saying that our collective money, taxpayers' money, so meaning individuals and companies who may not have kids, but as a society, we're saying this is a social priority. It's important for our economy. It's important for the well-being of children, for women and for men. And so we're saying we're taking a collective decision to use our collective resources, our taxpayer dollars, to support individual parents, just like we do that with education. We say we're going to support public education even if my kids are grown up and don't use it, or I don't have kids and never intend to, whatever it might be. So that and this is why intervening at the political level is so important, and how we must mobilize and not just be cynical about politicians this and that, but to really mobilize to push for effective change in a number of areas, including whether it's the environment and taking responsibility finally for our future, or for gender equality and many other things.
Michael, this has been a really, really enlightening and helpful conversation, especially because at the beginning I mentioned, what can I do in my own life to be a better, fuller, stronger person in light of these movements, in light of gender equality. And everything you've said, especially in that last answer, is concretely helpful. I think especially because I can ask myself, how do I have better intentions? Well, look at the impacts of what I'm doing. They're interrelated. They can't just be seen as these two distinct things. And I think that nuanced answer allows us to lead more nuanced lives, but also see sometimes the black and white difference and the black and white problems that we cause through whether it's inaction or action that is misguided. And I can't say enough how helpful and insightful this conversation has been. So, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you, and you and I and listeners and everyone, we're living this amazing moment of human history, the gender equality revolution, and this is a moment that our great grandchildren are going to be reading about in the history books. This is the moment. We are living the gender equality revolution. So this is a chance. This is a chance for us all to make history. And so I say, obviously many women have already joined that revolution. And my book is an appeal to men to sign up, to be part of this amazing change that is critical for the women that we know and love, and those many more that we'll never know and meet. It's critical for our children and their future. It's critical for men as well. And as we're beginning to discover, it's also critical for just the future of the planet. So thank you, thank you, Ben, for this chance to talk. These are fantastic questions and conversation. I have a lot of these, but this is going to stand out as right up there at the top. So thank you so much.
Great, it was my pleasure. Thanks, Michael. To learn more about Michael Kaufman, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, blog posts, and ways to get in touch with me to give me your feedback on this episode or any other. Now, your quote of the week is from the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. Gender equality is more than a goal in itself. It is a precondition for meeting the challenge of reducing poverty, promoting sustainable development, and building good governance. Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein for the music of this show, and special thanks for this episode to Michael Kaufman for allowing us to record in his beautiful home in Toronto. Next week we're chatting with Leslie Wood, Professor of Sociology at York University in Toronto. I'll see you then.